Written texts that exploit orthographic elements pose problems for translators that are similar to those created by overlapping considerations of sound and meaning. Mnemonic devices, for example, are composed of words that are chosen to help remember other words. Are these devices translatable? Which considerations should guide their translation? The sentence, "Every good boy does fine," is a mnemonic device that is frequently used to help aspiring musicians and others remember the notes associated with the musical staff. Translating the sentence into other languages is possible, but translating the meanings of the words typically will not produce a mnemonic device with the same function in the target language. This is both because the translated words will usually begin with different letters than their English equivalents, and because the names of the notes are different in other languages. Many languages do, however, have sentences that function the same as "every good boy does fine," but whose meanings are very different. In German, for example, the sentence "Eine Gans hat 3 Federn" is sometimes used as just such a memory aid. It functions the same way, but its meaning is "a goose has 3 feathers." Would you consider this a legitimate translation of the sentence "every good boy does fine"? In which context might it be okay, and in which context would it not? An even more complex example is the note sent by the captive camper in video 23. In this instance, the contents of the note served as a smokescreen for the author's real message, which could be discerned by considering just the first letters of each sentence. If this note is translated, can the content of the full text be preserved while also preserving the hidden message? If not, which is more important to replicate? Obviously, the hidden message is the most important aspect to preserve. This is an equivalent of that hidden message in French, and this is a text which could be used to convey that message. Note that the words of the note in the target language do not attempt to replicate the contents of the original, but do sound like something a kid at camp might send to his mom. Does this count as a legitimate translation? A larger challenge in translating the note might be that the people who make up the culture whose members speak the target language may have no notion of what summer camp is or the social patterns that lead to a child attending one. Not only will the term summer camp need to be explained, but the target language reader will need some idea of the relationship structures, expectations, economics, and societal calendar of the source culture to make any sense of what's going on. Cultural patterns inform every aspect of communication and are often the key to determining how information conveyed by language will be received. As we noted in video 2, cultural patterns establish the framework within which we develop our understanding of what is normal, what is exceptional, what is deviant, and what is shocking. Culture both establishes the basis for our expectations and provides the playbook for our understanding of what it means when things don't go according to those expectations. The challenge this creates for translation is that, even if the words used in the target language adequately convey the information that is explicit in the source text, the cultural framework of the target audience may lead them to infer things that are significantly different to what would be inferred by the original audience. To try to get a feel for this, let's consider this sentence in Mongolian, which presents several significant challenges for a translator. The first challenge is how to convey the meaning of the first word. The last half of this word is a suffix that helps Mongolian speakers narrow down the grammatical role the word plays in the sentence. In an English translation, this information would typically be conveyed by word order and prepositions. The first half of the word is a noun that's pronounced more or less zud, and which for purposes of this discussion will represent with this transliteration. In Mongolian and other languages spoken in the region, zud refers to an extreme weather event that kills off vast numbers of livestock. The weather event may be anything from a heat wave to a drought to a blizzard, but any such event does not qualify as zud unless it destroys lots of animals. Can you think of one English word that expresses the same information? I can't. For the time being, we'll sidestep the translation challenge posed by this term by simply borrowing the word zud and move on to consider other issues that arise when translating the sentence. finding English equivalents for the rest of the words is a bit easier, and doing so allows us to propose a first draft of a translation. The next challenge we'll consider is how to translate this word, which we've rendered town in our draft translation. Translating this word is problematic not because, like Zud, it conveys more information than the available English terms we might use, but rather because it conveys less information than they do. We can think of it as a label for a fairly generic category that includes not only typical reference of the English word town, but also those of the words village and city as well. How should we go about deciding which term to use in our translation? Another issue is that, while English requires that nouns be marked for definite and indefinite, Mongolian does not. And the grammar of this sentence does not tell us if we should translate this word using a or the. This means that if we only rely on the information made explicit in the sentence, we might end up translating the word one of 7 different ways, 6 of which would probably convey ideas different to what the author of the original intended to convey. Even if the translator does happen to choose the correct article-noun combination, however, an American reader of an English translation would not likely infer the same thing from the sentence as would a Mongolian reader of the original. This is because their understanding of the situation is likely to be informed by a different set of cultural assumptions. For an American, a trip to an urban center is no big deal, and the timing of such a trip is of no great consequence. For a Mongolian, a rural family would be likely to make such a journey in the wake of a Zud only if all their livestock had been wiped out, their livelihood had been destroyed, and they had become internally displaced people. For rural Mongolians in this predicament, this trip to the city is likely to be one from which they will not return. For Americans, this sentence describes a road trip. For Mongolians, it describes a catastrophe. Another inference that Mongolians would be likely to make is that the city in question is Ulaanbaatar. This is because Ulaanbaatar is the only major metropolis in Mongolia, and it is where millions of displaced nomads have moved in recent decades. For people in this predicament, moving to the city does not involve finding an apartment or home in the suburbs. Instead, it means pitching their gur on one of the vast and growing shantytowns on the outskirts of the city. Given the difference in the interpretive context of the original and the translation, how should the sentence be translated for an audience composed of American English speakers? How should the word Zed be translated? Should the translator try to figure out exactly which kind of disastrous weather event the original sentence was referring to and translate it with the appropriate English term? Or should she stick with the transliteration and explain it in a footnote? How should she convey the information that the event probably killed enough of the family's livestock that continuing their traditional lifestyle was no longer possible? Should that information be included in the text, expressed in some other way, or simply left unexpressed? Should she make other cultural and situational information that informs the original audience's understanding explicit in the translation? Assume the target audience will learn of this another way, or simply ignore its existence? It's important to keep in mind that all of these approaches are legitimate options, and that all of them fall within the broad definition of the term translation, and that there are no laws or moral imperatives that dictate which approach a translator should take. Each approach has its own strengths and weaknesses. Approaches which favor sticking as close as possible to the wording of the original text can be useful tools in the academic study of an original, especially when those who use these texts are familiar with the other aspects of the original interpretive context. Such translations, however, can be difficult for the casual or uninitiated reader to understand and tend to neglect poetic and other aesthetic aspects of the original. Approaches that make lots of implicit cultural and situational information explicit can make texts accessible to people who might otherwise find them obscure and impenetrable, thus opening them up to a much wider potential audience. Making implicit information explicit, however, can flatten nuance and tends to turn art into explanation. It is also possible that implicit information that the translator believed was part of the original interpretive context actually wasn't, and that in attempting to clarify the meaning of the original message to a new target audience, the translator inadvertently distorts it. Yet this risk can seldom be entirely avoided, as differences in word meanings and the grammar of the languages often require translators to make information explicit in a translation that was only implicit in the original. Whichever approach is chosen, though, it would be a good idea for the translator to tell the target audience which approach they did take, so that readers or listeners can adjust their expectations accordingly. After 27 videos, we're ready to propose some answers to the questions we started with. Translation is hard because, to do it successfully, translators need to accomplish many things at once. They must consider the information, emotions, and attitudes communicated by the message created in one language, along with the sounds and structures used to communicate them. They need to take into account not only the words being used, but also the situations and cultures in which they are employed, and the purposes to which they are being put. And they need to understand what those words revealed about the relationship between the originator of the message and the people being addressed. Translators then need to come up with a way to express that information, those emotions, and those relationships in a way that can be understood by people who not only speak a different language, but who live in a different time and place, with expectations and relationships structured within the framework of a different culture. Often, translation can't succeed until the target audience understands events, concerns, conventions, and relationships that structure the expectations of the original audience, things that are often difficult or impossible to incorporate in a translated text. When this is the case, successful translation may require an accompanying explanation of the aspects of the context that led the original audience to infer what they did. Finally, translators need to consider the expectations of their target audience, as well as those of the original audience. Just as each original message was formulated with reference to the interpretive context that the original author shared with the intended recipients, each translation of that message must be formulated in a way that takes into account the new interpretive context that arises from the experiences, beliefs, and assumptions of the target audience. The translator must thoroughly understand the former to correctly interpret the original, and must thoroughly understand the latter in order to re-express the meaning of the original in a way that can be understood in the new.